You people never learn, do you? Sergeant Luke Reynolds said it loud enough for the entire intersection to hear, his voice carrying over the low hum of idling engines and the distant wail of a city bus pulling to a stop 2 blocks away. And for a moment, even the late afternoon traffic on Jefferson Avenue seemed to hesitate, as if the street itself was holding its breath. Dr. Naomi Carter stood beside her silver sedan, the July heat pressing against her shoulders like a heavy coat she hadn't chosen to wear, the sun still high over the downtown skyline, reflecting off glass buildings and glinting against the polished surface of Reynolds' badge. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with a calm, steady gaze that made the blinking red light on his body camera feel louder than it was. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and gasoline, that distinct summer scent that rises off pavement when the temperature pushes past 90 degrees, and a few pedestrians slowed on the sidewalk, curiosity pulling them closer while keeping a cautious distance. Reynolds adjusted his utility belt with a sharp tug, posture rigid, confidence radiating from him like heat waves off the hood of her car, a man used to being obeyed without question, a man who believed the uniform did the talking so he didn't have to. Naomi's hands rested lightly at her sides, fingers relaxed, her navy blazer crisp despite the humidity, her posture straight but unthreatening, the kind of composure built over years of boardrooms, courtrooms, and quiet observation. She had been driving home from a compliance review meeting at a federal building less than 5 miles away, her mind still turning over notes and case files, when the flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror without warning. She had pulled over promptly, signaled clearly, rolled her window down halfway as instructed in every driver's handbook in America, and waited. What she hadn't expected was the tone, the assumption folded into his first sentence before she had spoken a single word. License and registration. He had said earlier, clipped and impatient, and when she asked calmly what the reason for the stop was, the corner of his mouth had lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. Now, standing outside her car, with the crosswalk signal ticking down from 15 seconds in a faint electronic countdown, she could feel dozens of unseen eyes from nearby storefront windows and parked vehicles. A delivery driver leaned slightly out of his truck window. A woman with a stroller paused at the curb. Phones were appearing, not dramatically, not theatrically, just quietly raised in that modern reflex that said this might matter later. Reynolds stepped closer, boots firm against the concrete, his shadow cutting across Naomi's shoes. "You were weaving," he added, though his tone suggested the explanation was an afterthought, not a reason. Naomi tilted her head slightly, the movement slow and deliberate. "I was driving within the posted limit, officer," she replied evenly, her voice smooth, controlled, neither defiant nor submissive, simply factual. The bodycam light blinked again, red against black plastic, recording every syllable, every inflection. A faint breeze stirred, lifting a loose strand of her hair across her cheek before letting it fall back into place. She did not brush it away. She did not look around for reassurance. She focused only on him. The traffic light above them shifted from green to yellow to red, casting a brief amber glow over the scene, as if nature itself were marking the moment. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Authority, when questioned politely, can feel like a challenge to those who rely on it. He glanced at the gathering onlookers, and then back at Naomi, and for a fraction of a second something flickered behind his eyes, not doubt, not yet, but awareness that this interaction was no longer private. Naomi noticed the flicker. She noticed everything. The heat, the cameras, the rhythm of the crosswalk signal resetting. She noticed the way his radio crackled softly at his shoulder, and the way his stance shifted half an inch when a black SUV rolled slowly past before disappearing down the block. She breathed in once, slow and measured, the kind of breath that steadies a room before a difficult question is asked. "Officer," she said gently, her tone almost conversational despite the tension coiling through the air. "Are you certain this stop is justified?" Around them, the city continued, horns in the distance, footsteps on concrete, the ordinary soundtrack of an American afternoon. But at the center of it all stood 2 figures locked in a quiet collision of power and poise, and the small red light on his camera kept blinking, recording not just a traffic stop, but the opening seconds of something far bigger than either of them had planned. Naomi had learned a long time ago that silence can be louder than shouting, and as she stood beneath the relentless July sun on Jefferson Avenue, she let the quiet stretch just enough to make her composure unmistakable. She was 38 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, and carried herself with the kind of steady confidence that did not need volume to be felt. Her navy blazer concealed the subtle weight of credentials earned over more than a decade of federal service, though nothing about her outward appearance suggested power. To most people passing by, she was simply another black woman pulled over on a busy street, another image that felt uncomfortably familiar in the American landscape. But familiarity can be deceptive. Reynolds shifted his stance again, boots planted wide as though anchoring himself to authority. Yet Naomi noticed how his eyes kept drifting toward the gathering crowd. A teenager across the street held his phone higher now, elbows tucked in tight, recording steadily. An older man in a baseball cap stood beside a parking meter, pretending to check his watch while clearly listening. The crosswalk signal chirped its electronic warning for pedestrians to finish crossing, the countdown restarting as the light turned green again. Naomi's sedan idled quietly behind her, hazard lights blinking in patient rhythm, as though even the vehicle understood this moment required restraint. She remembered her grandmother's voice from years ago in Atlanta, telling her that dignity was a shield no one could take unless she handed it over. That lesson had followed her through law school, through the long nights studying constitutional precedent, through the competitive interviews in Washington, District of Columbia, where she learned to measure every word before speaking. She had built her career in compliance and oversight, reviewing patterns, identifying misconduct, tracing small irregularities that revealed larger truths. She knew the power of documentation. She knew the value of evidence captured in real time. And right now, she was acutely aware of every recording device pointed in her direction, including the one clipped to the center of Reynolds' chest. The blinking red light did not intimidate her. If anything, it steadied her further. "You asked if the stop was justified," Reynolds said, his tone sharpening slightly as though politeness from her felt like defiance to him. "I do not need to justify anything to you." Naomi kept her hands visible, fingers relaxed, voice even. "I understand you have a job to do," she replied, making sure each syllable was clear and measured. "I am simply asking for clarification." The breeze shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of coffee from a nearby cafe, mingling with the sharpness of hot pavement. A city bus lumbered past in the outer lane, passengers turning their heads toward the scene, faces framed in rectangular windows like silent witnesses. Reynolds adjusted his sunglasses, though the sun had begun to dip slightly westward, casting longer shadows across the sidewalk. He circled half a step around her vehicle, scanning the interior through the open driver's side door as though expecting something extraordinary to reveal itself. There was nothing there but a leather briefcase on the passenger seat, a stainless steel water bottle in the cup holder, and a neatly folded cardigan on the back seat. Ordinary objects. Ordinary life. The tension did not come from what was visible. It came from what was assumed. Naomi felt the weight of that assumption pressing into the air between them. She had encountered it before in quieter spaces, in conference rooms where her expertise was questioned until confirmed, in meetings where her recommendations were attributed to someone else until she calmly corrected the record. She had learned that composure unsettles those who expect fear. Reynolds stepped back in front of her, radio crackling faintly at his shoulder, the metallic scent of his uniform mixing with the heat. "Step over here," he instructed, gesturing toward the front of her car. His voice was controlled but edged with impatience. Naomi complied without hesitation, heels clicking softly against the concrete, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. She noticed the reflection of the sky in the windshield, a wide blue expanse broken only by thin white clouds drifting lazily overhead. Above them, mounted at the corner of the intersection, a traffic camera rotated slowly, its lens angled downward with quiet indifference. The world was watching in more ways than one. Reynolds glanced again at the growing circle of bystanders, his jaw tightening slightly. Authority thrives in isolation, and this moment was anything but isolated. Naomi met his gaze once more, steady and unflinching, her voice calm enough to carry without force. "Officer," she said softly, the word neither confrontational nor submissive. "Simply factual. I would appreciate transparency in this process." The red light on his body camera blinked again, steady as a heartbeat, recording not only her words but the subtle shift in atmosphere as something beneath the surface began to take shape. Sergeant Luke Reynolds had built his reputation on control, and control was something he guarded carefully, especially in public. He had served on the force for 12 years, earned commendations for traffic enforcement and community patrol, and learned early that confidence, when displayed firmly enough, could end most interactions before they truly began. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, shoulders squared beneath the weight of his uniform, the silver insignia on his chest catching the sunlight each time he shifted. Around the department, he was known for being decisive. Among certain neighborhoods, he was known for something else, though that was rarely written down. Complaints had been filed before, informal remarks about tone and pattern, about stops that felt unnecessary, about warnings delivered with commentary that lingered longer than procedure required. None of those records had altered his posture on Jefferson Avenue. From his perspective, this was routine. A traffic stop, a driver who asked too many questions, a crowd that would disperse once the moment lost its novelty. Yet there was a subtle difference in the air now, something he could not quite name. Naomi watched him with an attentiveness that did not appear confrontational, yet it was impossible to ignore. She did not interrupt. She did not step back. She simply observed, the way she had been trained to observe when reviewing internal reports and policy deviations. She noted the slight delay before he responded to her last request for transparency. She noted the way his gaze flicked briefly toward the rotating traffic camera mounted high above the intersection. She noted the way his radio emitted a soft burst of static, followed by a voice requesting a routine status update from another unit 3 blocks away. Reynolds cleared his throat, a subtle adjustment that suggested he felt the weight of being watched. "You are being detained for further investigation," he said finally, the phrase sounding official but lacking specifics. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "For what specific violation?" she asked, her tone steady, neither raised nor lowered. The delivery driver across the street shifted his stance, leaning against the side of his truck as though settling in for a longer view. A young woman in athletic clothing stepped closer to the curb, phone held at chest level, capturing every word. The city continued its steady rhythm around them, horns in the distance, the faint chime of a nearby storefront door opening and closing. Yet the space between Naomi and Reynolds felt insulated from it all, like a separate stage carved out of ordinary life. Reynolds adjusted his sunglasses again even though the light had softened slightly as thin clouds drifted overhead. Authority, when certain of itself, rarely explains. But uncertainty has a way of demanding justification. "You were weaving within your lane," he repeated, though the phrasing sounded rehearsed now. Naomi considered his words carefully. She had driven that route countless times, measured her speed with habitual precision, aware that certain corridors of the city carried unspoken scrutiny. She understood patterns. She understood how repetition could create perception. And she understood that this particular stop fit into something larger than a single afternoon. Reynolds stepped half a pace closer, his boots pressing firmly into the concrete, as though proximity could reinforce his position. Yet he avoided direct eye contact for a fraction of a second when another phone camera shifted closer to capture his profile. Naomi's composure remained unchanged. Her breathing stayed even, her shoulders relaxed beneath her blazer, her briefcase still visible through the open driver's door. She had spent years examining misconduct cases where small details told the greater story. She knew that tone, posture, and timing often revealed more than any written citation. Above them, the traffic lights cycled again, casting a brief wash of green across the pavement before turning amber. The rotating camera at the corner continued its slow, mechanical sweep, indifferent yet observant. Reynolds spoke again, his voice firm but slightly tighter than before. "If you cooperate, this will go quickly." Naomi met his gaze fully now, her eyes calm, unhurried, reflecting neither fear nor defiance. "I am cooperating," she said softly. "I simply expect the same clarity in return." The red light on his body camera blinked steadily between them, capturing not only the exchange of words but the subtle shift in balance as the afternoon sun dipped lower and the ordinary noise of the city framed a moment that was no longer as routine as it first appeared. The air between them tightened in a way that was almost imperceptible, like the moment before a summer storm finally breaks, and Sergeant Reynolds seemed to make a decision. He stepped closer to the open driver's side door of Naomi's sedan and peered inside again, his reflection faintly visible in the tinted window. "I am going to take a look inside your vehicle," he said, the words delivered as a statement rather than a request. Naomi did not move abruptly. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned her head slightly toward him, her expression calm but unmistakably alert. "On what legal basis?" she asked, her tone steady, each word clear enough to carry across the sidewalk without effort. The question did not sound emotional. It sounded procedural. Around them, the small audience had grown by a few more curious faces. A man in a gray business suit paused at the corner, briefcase in hand. A cyclist slowed to a stop near the curb, one foot resting on the pavement, helmet tilted toward the scene. The blinking red light on Reynolds' body camera continued its steady rhythm, recording everything, impartial and precise. Reynolds placed one hand on the roof of her car, fingers spread against the warm metal as if grounding himself. "You are being uncooperative," he replied, though his voice carried a slight edge that had not been there before. Naomi inhaled slowly, the scent of hot concrete and distant coffee lingering in the air. "I have complied with every instruction," she said calmly. "I stepped out of the vehicle. I provided identification. I am standing where you directed. Asking a question is not resistance." The words settled over the intersection with quiet weight. A car horn sounded briefly from a vehicle waiting at the red light, then fell silent as the driver realized the traffic was not moving because of them. Reynolds glanced at the onlookers again, noticing the raised phones, the focused stares. Authority thrives when unquestioned, but scrutiny changes its texture. He circled toward the front of the car, his boots striking the pavement with measured steps, and positioned himself directly in front of Naomi. "Step back," he instructed, gesturing toward the sidewalk. Naomi complied without hesitation, taking 2 deliberate steps backward until the edge of the curb pressed lightly against the heel of her shoe. She kept her hands visible, fingers relaxed at waist level, posture composed. Her briefcase remained on the passenger seat, partially visible through the open door, its leather surface catching a glint of sunlight. Reynolds leaned slightly toward the interior of the vehicle, scanning the dashboard and seats, as though expecting something extraordinary to appear under the glare of public attention. There was nothing there beyond ordinary belongings, yet the gesture itself carried implication. Naomi watched him carefully, not with fear, but with assessment. She had reviewed countless reports where small procedural shortcuts led to larger questions. She knew how easily perception could shift in the presence of cameras. The traffic light above them turned green again, cars inching forward cautiously, drivers craning their necks to see. A faint breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby street tree, scattering a few dry fragments across the sidewalk. "You understand that consent must be voluntary," Naomi said evenly, her voice neither raised nor lowered. "And I do not consent to a search without proper cause." The sentence was delivered with the clarity of someone who understood both her rights and the weight of invoking them. Reynolds straightened slowly, his jaw tightening, as though the simplicity of her statement unsettled him more than any confrontation might have. The red light on his camera blinked steadily between them, capturing his pause. For a fraction of a second, uncertainty flickered across his expression, quickly masked by a firmer stance. The city continued its rhythm around them, but the balance had shifted slightly, almost invisibly. What had begun as a routine stop now carried a different tone, one defined not by raised voices or force, but by calm insistence on process. Naomi met his gaze again, unwavering, her composure intact beneath the bright American sun, as the quiet tension in the intersection deepened and something larger than a traffic citation began to take shape. The tension that had been quietly building now reached a sharper edge, not through raised voices or sudden movements, but through implication. Sergeant Reynolds took a small step closer again, reducing the space between them to less than 2 feet, close enough that Naomi could see the faint crease forming at the corner of his mouth. "If you have nothing to hide, then this should not be a problem," he said, the phrase delivered with practiced familiarity, as though he had used it many times before. The words hovered in the humid air, carrying an unspoken suggestion that innocence required surrender. Naomi felt the eyes of the crowd settle more firmly on them. The cyclist shifted his weight, the businessman lowered his briefcase slightly, and the woman with the stroller angled her phone higher to capture both faces clearly. The blinking red light on Reynolds' body camera remained steady, indifferent to tone, documenting each syllable. Naomi kept her voice even. "Rights are not dependent on suspicion," she replied. "They exist regardless of assumption." The sentence was quiet, but it landed with precision. Reynolds' jaw tightened again. He moved toward the open door and reached just inside the frame of the vehicle, his hand hovering near the edge of the dashboard without fully entering. The gesture was subtle, but carried weight. It suggested control. It suggested authority extending beyond spoken words. Naomi did not lunge forward. She did not raise her hands. She remained still, breathing slow and steady, but her eyes tracked every movement. "I am advising you again," she said calmly, "that I do not consent to a search without proper cause." The breeze shifted, scattering a few dry leaves across the pavement. A passing car slowed, then continued on as the light changed. The sound of distant sirens echoed faintly from another part of the city, unrelated yet oddly fitting, like background music underscoring the moment. Reynolds withdrew his hand and stepped back slightly, though his posture remained firm. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, voice lower now, less performative and more personal. Naomi noticed the subtle change. The confidence that had been absolute at the beginning of the stop now carried a trace of irritation. Authority challenged calmly can feel like erosion. Complicated would be ignoring procedure. Naomi answered, her gaze steady. Clarity prevents complication. The words were not confrontational. They were factual. A murmur passed through the small cluster of bystanders, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to signal collective awareness. Reynolds shifted his weight again and reached for his radio, pressing the button briefly before releasing it without speaking. The gesture appeared instinctive, almost reflexive, as though he were considering escalation but hesitating in the presence of so many cameras. Naomi felt the warmth of the sun on her shoulders, the faint trickle of sweat at the back of her neck, yet her posture remained upright and composed. She was acutely aware of the intersection camera. Above them, rotating in its slow mechanical arc, capturing the broader view. She was aware of the delivery driver still leaning against his truck, eyes narrowed in concentration. She was aware that every second extended the scene beyond a simple stop and into something else entirely. Reynolds exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that carried frustration more than authority. "I can detain you further if necessary," he said, the statement hovering between warning and assertion. Naomi met his gaze fully, unflinching. "If that is your decision, I will comply," she answered. "But I will also ensure that the full context is documented." The red light blinked again between them, unwavering. In that instant, the balance shifted almost imperceptibly. What had begun as a display of control now carried the weight of scrutiny. Reynolds seemed to sense it too, though he did not step back. The city continued to move around them, ordinary and indifferent, yet within that small square of concrete and sunlight, the pressure of visibility tightened like a lens focusing sharply into place, and the moment edged closer to revelation. For a brief moment, everything slowed. The distant hum of traffic softened into a low murmur, like sound drifting underwater. A thin cloud passed across the sun, muting the glare and casting a cooler light over the intersection. Naomi felt the subtle shift in temperature on her skin, the warmth easing just enough to register. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply allowed the silence to stretch, because silence, when chosen, can be stronger than argument. Sergeant Reynolds stood a few feet in front of her now, shoulders squared, radio clipped against his chest, the red light on his body camera blinking steadily between them like a measured heartbeat. He had just asserted the possibility of further detention, but the certainty in his tone had thinned. It was not fear. Not yet. It was awareness. Awareness that this moment was no longer private. Naomi let her eyes drift briefly upward, toward the traffic camera mounted on the metal pole at the corner of Jefferson Avenue. It rotated slowly, methodically, capturing wide angles of the street below. Then she looked at his body camera. The small lens reflected a distorted image of her face, calm and composed, framed by the summer sky behind her. She exhaled slowly through her nose, steady and deliberate, the kind of breath that steadies a courtroom before testimony begins. "You are aware that this is being recorded," she said softly, not as a challenge, but as a reminder. Reynolds gave a short nod, almost impatient. "That is standard procedure," he replied. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice still even. "Good." The word was simple, but it carried weight. Around them, the bystanders had grown quieter. The cyclist remained at the curb, one hand resting on the handlebar, eyes fixed forward. The businessman shifted his stance, but did not leave. A young woman whispered something to the person beside her, then fell silent again. The city felt suspended, as though waiting for the next line in a script neither of them had fully revealed. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly to her own hands, still relaxed at waist level. There was no tremor in her fingers. No urgency, just patience. She knew timing mattered. She knew escalation often revealed more than resistance ever could. Reynolds adjusted his footing again, boots scraping lightly against the pavement. "If there is nothing else," he said, tone tightening, "this can end quickly." Naomi looked back at him, meeting his eyes fully. There was no anger in her expression, no accusation, only a quiet steadiness that seemed almost out of place in such a charged moment. "I agree," she said. "It can." A faint breeze swept across the intersection again, lifting the edge of her blazer and stirring the leaves of the small tree planted near the curb. The traffic light changed once more, casting a brief amber glow across the hood of her car before turning red. The blinking camera light reflected off the windshield, tiny and persistent. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, a controlled movement that drew Reynolds' attention without appearing dramatic. "Before we proceed further," she continued, her voice calm but unmistakably intentional, "I would like to clarify something." Reynolds' brow furrowed, impatience flickering across his face. "Clarify what?" he asked. Naomi glanced once more at the body camera, then at the intersection camera above, then back to him. The pause was deliberate. The air felt heavier now, not from heat, but from anticipation. She reached slowly toward the inside pocket of her blazer, movements unhurried and visible, careful to ensure there was no misunderstanding in the gesture. The crowd seemed to lean in collectively, breath held without realizing it. Reynolds' posture stiffened, his hand hovering near his belt, not aggressive but alert. Naomi's fingers closed around something small and firm inside the lining of her jacket. She did not pull it out immediately. Instead, she met his gaze once more, her voice barely above conversational tone. "Transparency goes both ways," she said. The red light on his camera blinked again, steady and unwavering, as the moment balanced on the edge of revelation. Naomi did not rush the movement. Her fingers remained inside the inner pocket of her blazer for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, allowing the stillness to deepen, allowing every camera lens pointed at them to sharpen its focus. The breeze quieted. Even the low murmur of traffic seemed to dim, as if the city itself understood that something irreversible was about to surface. Sergeant Reynolds' eyes locked onto her hand, posture tightening, authority bracing for unpredictability. Naomi's expression did not change. No defiance, no triumph, just calm. Slowly, deliberately, she withdrew her hand from her jacket. Between her fingers was a small leather credential wallet, dark navy, edges worn slightly from years of use. She held it at chest level, making sure the movement remained visible and non-threatening. "You wanted transparency," she said softly. The leather flipped open with a quiet snap. Inside, beneath the clear protective sleeve, a polished federal badge caught the muted afternoon light. The gold shield reflected against the windshield of her car, bright enough to command attention without force. Below it, her identification card displayed her photograph, her full name, and the words Federal Bureau of Investigation. The red light on Reynolds' body camera blinked steadily, capturing the reflection of that badge in precise detail. For a moment, there was no sound at all. Not from the crowd, not from the traffic, not even from Reynolds. The confidence that had shaped his posture just minutes earlier drained from his expression in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders lowered by less than an inch, but enough to change the energy between them. "You are federal?" he asked, his voice no longer edged with impatience, but edged with something closer to uncertainty. Naomi held the badge steady, not too close, not too far, ensuring it remained within the frame of his camera. Supervisory Special Agent, she replied calmly. Internal Civil Rights Oversight Division. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. A quiet ripple passed through the bystanders. The cyclist straightened fully. The businessman exhaled softly. The woman with the stroller lowered her phone slightly, eyes widening. Reynolds swallowed, a small movement in his throat that the camera likely captured in sharp detail. You did not identify yourself, he said, though the statement lacked accusation now. Naomi's gaze remained steady. You did not ask, she answered. The simplicity of her response settled like gravity. Reynolds' hand dropped away from his belt. His stance shifted again, this time not to assert control, but to recalibrate it. This was a routine stop, he began, his tone adjusting rapidly, professional language returning in a careful cadence. Naomi closed the distance by half a step, still maintaining respectful space. This corridor has been flagged, she said quietly. Multiple complaints. Patterns of discretionary stops without documented cause. Today was part of an ongoing review. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him directly. She simply presented fact. The traffic camera above them continued its slow rotation. The body camera blinked red, unwavering. Reynolds' eyes flicked instinctively toward the small lens on his chest, then back to her badge. Are you saying this was an investigation? He asked, the words measured now, stripped of earlier certainty. Naomi closed the leather wallet gently, but did not return it to her pocket. I am saying, she replied, voice calm as ever, that every action taken during this stop has been documented. A black sport utility vehicle turned the corner at the far end of the block, moving slowly toward the intersection. It did not have flashing lights. It did not draw attention, but Naomi noticed it immediately. Reynolds noticed it seconds later. The quiet balance of power that had once leaned entirely in his favor now shifted fully in the opposite direction, not through aggression, not through force, but through revelation. The blinking red camera light continued its steady rhythm as the reality of the moment settled over him. And for the first time since the stop began, Sergeant Luke Reynolds looked less like the authority in control and more like a man realizing he had just walked into a lens far wider than he understood. The black sport utility vehicle rolled closer, its engine barely audible over the hum of the intersection, and it came to a controlled stop along the curb without sirens or flashing lights, understated but intentional. The tinted windows reflected the late afternoon sky before the driver's side door opened and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, followed by a woman carrying a slim tablet tucked beneath her arm. Neither rushed. Neither raised their voices. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Sergeant Reynolds felt it immediately. His shoulders, once squared with practiced authority, now seemed to settle lower, as though gravity had increased around him. He glanced at the badge still visible in Naomi's hand, then at the approaching figures, and then instinctively at the red light blinking on his chest. For the first time since the stop began, he adjusted his stance not to assert control, but to steady himself. Agent Carter, the man from the vehicle said calmly as he approached, offering a brief nod that was professional rather than performative. Naomi returned the nod with equal composure. Agent Morales, she replied evenly. The exchange was brief, efficient, and unmistakably official. The woman with the tablet positioned herself a few feet away, her expression focused but neutral, eyes scanning both Naomi and Reynolds before briefly glancing at the body camera mounted on his uniform. Reynolds cleared his throat. Is this necessary? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier edge. Naomi did not answer immediately. She closed her credential wallet and returned it to the inner pocket of her blazer with the same deliberate calm she had shown moments earlier. Documentation ensures clarity, she said softly. Agent Morales turned his attention to Reynolds. Sergeant, your body camera is active, correct? Reynolds nodded, the movement tight. Yes. Morales gestured slightly toward the small device. Good. We will need the full recording for review. The statement was procedural, not accusatory, yet it carried finality. Around them, the small crowd had grown quiet in a different way now, not curious but aware. The cyclist lowered his phone slowly. The businessman stepped back half a pace. The woman with the stroller watched with wide, steady eyes. Reynolds swallowed again, the sound faint but noticeable in the still air. This was a lawful stop, he said, though the confidence that once shaped his tone had thinned further. Naomi met his gaze calmly. That determination will be made through review, she replied. There was no triumph in her voice. No satisfaction. Only process. Agent Morales stepped closer to Reynolds, maintaining respectful distance. Sergeant, please remain available for follow-up, he said. We will coordinate with your department. The words were measured, but the implication was unmistakable. Reynolds nodded slowly, eyes drifting once more to the intersection camera above them, then back to Naomi. For a brief moment, something like realization crossed his face. Not anger, not resentment. Recognition. Recognition that the assumptions he had carried into this stop had collided with something far more structured than he anticipated. The late afternoon sun slipped partially behind another thin cloud, softening the light across the pavement. Naomi turned slightly toward her vehicle, signaling the end of her participation in the exchange. Am I free to leave? She asked, her voice calm as ever. Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Yes, he said quietly. The word carried none of its earlier authority. Naomi inclined her head once, acknowledging the response without commentary. Agent Morales stepped back toward the sport utility vehicle, the woman with the tablet already making brief notes. The red light on Reynolds' camera continued blinking, but now it seemed to record something entirely different from what it had at the beginning of the stop. The power dynamic had shifted completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through exposure. Reynolds remained standing at the intersection, uniform crisp, posture rigid, yet the certainty that once defined him had drained away, replaced by the heavy understanding that visibility changes everything. Naomi moved first, not with haste, not with flourish, but with the same quiet deliberation that had defined every step since the flashing lights first appeared in her rearview mirror. She turned toward her sedan, the late afternoon sun sliding lower behind the downtown skyline, casting long golden lines across the pavement. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, though nothing visible had changed. The traffic lights cycled again, green to yellow to red, as if marking the end of an unspoken chapter. She reached the driver's side door and paused briefly, glancing once more at the intersection camera above, and then at the small red light still blinking on Sergeant Reynolds' chest. The light had not stopped recording, but the meaning of what it captured had shifted completely. She opened her car door and slipped inside, placing both hands calmly on the steering wheel for a moment before inserting the key and turning the engine fully on. The familiar hum grounded her. Across the intersection, Agent Morales and his partner returned to their vehicle, doors closing with muted thuds that carried finality without spectacle. Reynolds remained standing near the front of her car, posture still upright, but no longer rigid, his shoulders subtly lowered, gaze unfocused for a second longer than before. The bystanders began to disperse in small increments, conversations resuming in hushed tones. The cyclist pushed off the curb and pedaled away. The businessman adjusted his tie and continued down the sidewalk. The woman with the stroller lowered her phone and crossed the street as the signal permitted. Life resumed its steady American rhythm, ordinary and unremarkable, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Naomi checked her mirrors carefully, signaling before easing back into the flow of traffic. Her car merged smoothly into the right lane, tires rolling over warm asphalt that still radiated the heat of a 90-degree afternoon. She did not look back immediately. She did not need to. The lesson of the moment was not about humiliation or victory. It was about visibility. A mile down Jefferson Avenue, the skyline opened slightly, revealing a stretch of blue sky above the rooftops. Naomi exhaled slowly, tension she had not allowed herself to acknowledge finally releasing from her shoulders. She thought about the complaints that had been filed over the past 6 months, about the patterns documented in spreadsheets and sworn statements, about the small but consistent deviations from protocol that added up to something larger. Change rarely arrived in dramatic gestures. It arrived through documentation, through patience, through calm insistence on process. Back at the intersection, Sergeant Reynolds finally moved, adjusting the strap of his body camera as if suddenly aware of its weight. He glanced once at the departing federal vehicle, then at the corner traffic camera above, then down at the pavement where Naomi had stood minutes earlier. The certainty that once guided his steps felt different now, tempered by awareness that every action exists within a wider frame than one might assume. A passing sedan slowed briefly, then continued on. The city did not pause for reflection, but reflection lingered anyway. Naomi continued driving, the city blocks passing in measured intervals, storefronts giving way to residential streets lined with oak trees. The sunlight filtered through leaves, creating shifting patterns across her windshield. She maintained the speed limit precisely, as she always did, hands steady at 10 and 2. There was no smile on her face, no outward sign of triumph. Only resolve. Justice, she knew, was rarely loud. It did not need to shout to be real. Sometimes it simply required standing still long enough for the truth to reveal itself under the steady blink of a camera light. As she turned onto her street and the skyline faded behind her, the afternoon settled into quiet, and the only sound inside the car was the steady rhythm of the engine and the soft whisper of tires against the road, carrying her forward into a future shaped not by anger, but by accountability.